thanks everyone for coming and welcome to our webinar on how is humanitarian learning adapting to global changes and sector trends. And so we've got a really good lineup of organisations today, and hopefully we'll have a really good discussion. I just wanted to start with a couple of little housekeeping bits. So firstly, just to say we're recording. Secondly, if you want to turn on captions, you should be able to do that at the bottom of your screen. If you click where there's the three dots and it says more, there should be the option to turn on captions. And then finally, we're going to kind of save all of the questions and things to the end of the webinar. So if you want to type into the Q&A as we go along, then we'll get to those at the end. So yeah, please just feel free to type your questions in throughout as they come to you, and then we'll get to those. So how is humanitarian learning adapting to global changes and sector trends? Let me introduce you to the organisations that my colleague Anna, Lear and I are hosting today. So we've got a great lineup with ALNAP, disasterready.org, Anna Lear, who's my co-host from GroupURD, and Primary Care International today. So really interesting mixture of organisations as well as our HLA representatives. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Anna to talk a bit more about who we've got today in the room and what's on our agenda.
Yes, hi everyone, thanks Esther, and we're delighted to welcome you all here. I can see lots of names that are familiar, organisations that we know, and some people we don't know. So great to see you all. And as whether you're a training provider, whether you're a consultant, whether you're working in a learning and development team, or any of these roles, or whether you're a learner yourself, I think the next hour will have something for all of you. So we're really looking forward to it. As Esther said, myself, Anna Lear, I'm training coordinator at GroupURD in France, and together with Esther Grieder from the HLA, will be your hosts for today's webinar. Next slide, please, Esther. And just quickly to introduce our fabulous panel, we are delighted today to welcome Dr. Mamsallah Faal Omisore, who is Clinical Director for PCI. And Mamsallah will be sharing some thoughts that may arise from an overly technological approach to training. Secondly, we have Lacroix, who is Senior Partnerships Manager for Disaster Ready, who will be looking a bit at self-directed learning. Then we have Mureti, who is here from the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, and she will give some of her insight into user-centered learning and innovation. And finally, Juliet Parker, who is Director for ALNAP, and who will be looking at the role of learning and supporting leadership within the sector. So welcome to you, our panel, and thanks for joining us today. Okay, next slide. We'll have a quick run through the agenda. So before we get on to our panelists, Esther and I, just to give us a quick introduction to the topic, we've brought together a couple of slides looking at a few details. So we'll go through those really quickly. Then we'll hand over to our panel. And finally, we'll end the hour with a 20 minutes Q&A session. So as Esther already mentioned, if you have any questions, we won't be stopping for questions after each presentation. But if you have a question while the person is talking or afterwards, don't hesitate to write it in the Q&A section. And Esther and I will be gathering those together as our panelists are talking, and we will put them to the panel at the end of the session. So thank you for that. Next slide. So where did this topic come from? Basically, the Training Providers Forum is a group of 10 organizations, training providers, working in the humanitarian development sector. And in the sort of post-COVID era, we were discussing how learning or what factors influence how learning is developed. And we brought together a quick guide, a short guide looking at this issue based on our own experience, and it is composed of 6 6 case studies, and we were interested in looking at what are the factors, you know, what determines whether we say, oh, well, this learning offer, this learning event will be developed online, or it'll be developed face-to-face, or a blend of which, and what makes us make these decisions. So this was a discussion we were having within this group. And with Esther, we thought it might be interesting at this point just to hear a bit from you. So we have a little question for you, and we'd like you to write this, so not in the Q&A this time, but in the chat. We'd like you to answer this following question. What is the biggest trend affecting learning delivery in your organization over the past 2 years? So if you're not in an organization, you can also just talk for yourself as an individual. And if you can start writing your answers, and you can write keywords, you can write a short sentence, but if you can just have a couple of few seconds to reflect, and then tell us what has been really influencing how you deliver training or learning in your organization or as an individual. And we're really looking at sort of the last 2 years, because we're all sort of a bit of aware there has been a leap in how things have changed.
So over to me, I think. I'm going to be really interested to see what people put in the chat there. Also, it's been nice to see that we've got people from all over the world joining today, so that's great. So I just wanted to talk a bit about this kind of question, about the wider question that we're addressing today, on what's influencing the way that we do humanitarian learning and training. And I guess one of the big things to point out is that as a sector, I guess we are responding to more and more complex crises these days. And that has led to kind of an explosion in the size of the humanitarian workforce as well. And I think it's an ALNAP report that cites that the workforce in the humanitarian sector has expanded by 40% since 2013. So that's a huge growth, and mostly in national and local organisations. So I guess that we can assume that with that huge growth in workforce, there's also kind of an expanded audience for humanitarian learning and training as well. And then some of the factors, I guess, that are determining how we deliver humanitarian training. As Anna says, the pandemic completely changed the way that we did pretty much everything, but that obviously took a lot of training online. And then the kind of explosion in new technologies, AI and things like that, kind of continues to open up new sort of possibilities in the way that we can deliver learning. So there's those things to take into account. But then there's also issues of kind of access in areas affected by complex and prolonged crises. For example, we're seeing more of those types of crisis. But how do we reach people that need to learn? What effect on infrastructure is there in prolonged crises that might mean that people don't have access to internet necessarily, or that that's not the best way to learn? So taking those factors into consideration as well. Climate change, obviously, as well as being an issue that is addressed by the humanitarian sector, also means that we have kind of a driver to reduce our travel related to humanitarian learning and training. And then the sector is also obviously always affected by funding considerations. But I think it's interesting to think about how the way that we fund humanitarian learning and training might change dependent on the format. So we've obviously seen lots of free training online, for example, which has different costs and different types of expertise attached to its delivery. So that's interesting to think about. Then over on the right-hand side there, I've put localization. I've got a separate slide on that, because I think that's more kind of, it's not something that's affecting us, I guess, from the outside as a sector. It's something that we as a sector hopefully are trying to move towards that agenda. And I think as people working in humanitarian learning and training, we also need to be thinking really carefully, and I think we're all just kind of grappling with it, about how we can contribute to that localization agenda. And I think part of that, as well is making sure that the learning that we deliver and the way that we deliver it isn't actually kind of contributing or reinforcing existing sort of power imbalances in the sector. So I've just put some kind of big questions around that here that we can just keep in our minds as we go through this. So whose knowledge is valued in the sector? What terminology should we be using? Does our approach to humanitarian learning reflect existing power imbalances in the sector? And then what can we be doing as people that work in humanitarian learning to support local and national organisations to make sure that the training is really tailored to those audiences and not kind of narrowly tailored to more international actors? And then how can learning support sector transformation? So just some kind of wider questions, which I don't think anybody has got the answer to completely, but that we're all kind of having in the backs of our minds as we have these types of conversations. And then finally, I just wanted to quickly reflect on the fact that in our sort of modern digital age, there's so many different calls on our time and on our attention, you know, from all of our devices and social media and things like that, and that also has an impact in how we think about designing and delivering humanitarian training, really trying to kind of make sure that the right messages are cutting through the noise and getting to the right people. And with that, over to Anna.
Yes, so we also thought it'd be interesting just to have a bit of data, a couple of statistics to help illustrate some of the things that we were talking about. So we had a look at various institutions that gather statistics on adult learning across the globe. And one of these, I mean, obviously there are so many, but one of these, Fosway, who carries out research based on interviews with senior learning professionals across Europe. Unfortunately, it wasn't more global, but interesting that in research that they brought out in 2022, highlighted on the one hand, you know, there's the sort of significant extent that L&D, so learning and development teams in organizations, have had to make huge changes to the way they support learning within this organization. And then complementary to this, we also have this statistic, this data that highlights to what extent, you know, digital learning fatigue, so learning online in front of a screen, is becoming more of a problem. So we thought that these two figures were quite interesting to have a look at. And we'll leave them, we're not going to delve into those specific aspects now. We'll leave these figures with you, and we're now going to hand over to our panel. So, next slide, please, Esther. And firstly, I would like to welcome Dr. Mamsallah Faal Omisore from Primary Care International, who is based in London. And Omisore, I believe, Mamsallah, you're going to be talking to us a little bit about how your organization is, well, you're sharing your thoughts on how technology is affecting learning. So can I hand over to you, please?
Thanks, Anna. It's a real, excuse me, it's a real privilege to be with you all this morning and to share our thoughts and also to share our stories as an organization when it comes to producing online learning. So if I can just go on to the next slide. So just to give you a bit of background and context, Primary Care International, an organization, has been in existence since 2014. And our sort of previous model of a priori online learning was very much face-to-face. And we focused on face-to-face with the idea that we would deliver the training and this will be cascaded to other people within their context. We recognized early on, certainly before the pandemic, that this was limited by the ability to scale. So we're already poised to think about technology as an option for improving that capacity to scale. And what the pandemic did for us, particularly, the disruption that came with that, was catalyze that innovation. And I think there's something to be said about whether you're ready to change. So that kind of innovation mindset. And because of that, we were able to reflect on a variety of learning models and learning modalities that can enhance the learning experience online. We were prepared to be flexible and agile in the product in terms of what we produce. And we were also fairly clear in our minds that it was important that we could iterate on that product and ensure that that product fitted in, within the operations of people in practice in primary care settings, wherever the learning was being acquired. But then that does come with risks. And I think my aim this morning is just to explore some of those risks with you of taking an overly technological approach to learning. So if we take on the next slide. And I think the first one right in the center is really the technology itself. I think technology is exciting. I think it has the capacity to do many and wonderful things yet untapped. I mean, there is AI, there's gamification, but there are also a lot of assumptions that come with that. It implies that there is a uniformity to people's access to technology or understanding of technology. And I think one of the problems with pushing forward with a technological approach to learning is that we have the risk of leaving people behind. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we have found around digital literacy, for example, the infrastructure to support that learning, both hardware and software, connectivity and internet access continue to be a problem. And we've also learned about, online learning fatigue. So I think there's something that we need to do around the technology itself to address that. Another aspect that is at risk, I think, is the aspect of communication. I think one of the areas that we probably haven't paid much attention to when we're doing sort of face-to-face learning, as we know, communication, a significant proportion of communication is nonverbal, and that nuance is lost in online learning. So the cultural and the language issues. And I'm not saying that we need to go back to where learning was, but we need to pay attention to that and see how we can mitigate for that when we produce online learning. The other aspect of things are the relationships that are built when people are together. So there is the learning that happens, but I think of much more value is the networks that are created by people who are in a learning space together, and those networks that continue to bear fruit beyond that learning experience. And I think there are challenges around online learning and how we can replicate that and ensure those networks persist. And I think people are trying to do that through communities of practice and online fora. And I think that there is something to be learned from some of those social media platforms where relationships are developed, like Instagram and WhatsApp and Telegram, that we can see what we can draw from to introduce into the online learning experience. Another aspect that I think we need to consider, and I'm sure a lot of online learning producers do think about this a lot, is equity in terms of thinking about your learner. How do we mitigate for differences in learner types? So previous methods of learning have evolved organically, have had a lot more time in terms of research to refine and develop. Online learning hasn't had that much time, and yet is expected to produce the quality of learning in terms of equity and standards that traditional learning has done in the past. So I think there is something to be said about how we address disabilities, people who have vision issues, hearing issues, physical disabilities, or even neurodiversity, how we can mitigate for that without the risk of excluding others. And then I just want to finally end up with evolution. And I think I sort of alluded to that earlier, which is, the process of learning traditionally has evolved over time, and there's been time to do that. But the rapid uptake of online learning is a challenge. And we probably need to reflect as organizations that produce learning on how we engage our learners to produce learning in the way that they want to have it, how we have an evolutionary mindset that is transformative without risking stagnation. So those are some of the risk considerations that I thought we need to think about, so that we're not sort of hurtling down this route of online learning without paying attention to these key areas, just because we've rapidly got on board with it, but not really given ourselves time to allow it to percolate and to learn from the process. Look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mamsallah. That's really interesting, having those risks put so succinctly and clearly. And as you said, any questions, we'd love to hear from you in the Q&A, and we'll be able to put them to our panel at the end of the session. And that your presentation leads us on very nicely to our next panelist, who is Lacroix. Can you share your thoughts with us on some of the trends sort of emerging in self-directed learning, which is obviously very complementary to some of the points that Mamsallah has just made?
Yeah, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Dr. Mamsallah, because without knowing exactly what you were going to touch on, it's really linking to a lot of the point I'm going to touch on. But maybe just quickly, and if we can go to the next slide, a quick few words of introduction about disaster relief for those of you who are maybe less familiar with our program. But we are a free online learning platform. So as it says in the previous title, it's really about online, self-directed, self-paced. So it's a very sort of niche service that we provide to the sector with in mind, the problem we've been trying to solve is reducing the barrier to access to education and professional development for the whole workforce within the humanitarian and development sector using the online learning technology. So like I said, there is a niche there, but the needs are super large, so we can serve a lot of a large audience. Also because we work in 4 languages, as it says on the screen, and this, we've been in existence for 10 years. We're celebrating our anniversary this year, and we've seen a growth of not only the learner joining the community on disaster relief, but the engagement to come back for more learning. And what we do is making sure we do provide evergreen, new resources all along. And we, it's a small team that we have, so it's not us creating that content, but we very much rely on the power of collaboration, which is such a key feature of our sector. For anybody who's been in that space, as many of us have been, we know it's not just a vain word. And a lot of what we do is curation of existing content and working with all sorts of partners, or then creating unique content, but still working with subject matter experts and actors from the sector to create that learning that we can then put on our platform. So we can provide that sort of high quality, relevant learning at no cost to all our learners, because individuals are our primary audience, but obviously most of these individuals work for organization or network. So we serve then these organizations as a contribution to their learning strategy and meet some of the learning needs. So that's us for a brief presentation. If we can go to the next slide. And again, like I said, Dr. Mamsallah, you touched on so many of the trend, and then the point of friction or the point of need that we are trying to respond. And let me just start with saying that are we are we everything to everyone? No. Should we be? No. And it's going back to the point I was making before, where it's about collaborating and providing one service within that space, where as training provider, as organization, as network, we try to contribute to that capacity strengthening that the sector needs. So the trends are many. In the 7 minutes I have, and I have put my timer, I can't cover them all, but I'm just going to touch on a few. And again, one word we've heard before is about agility, and I think that's one thing in our team we demonstrate, and it's part of our DNA, where we try to be agile, not only with the technology that we have, having access to that learning management system from the Cornerstone On-Demand organization, but also what do we use within what's available to us so we can remain relevant, because yes, the technology is accelerating in terms of what it can do with artificial intelligence and all these other things we've heard about, but is that going to work for everyone? We know it won't. So we try to make sure we pull what can be useful, but we keep in mind the really wide audience we have, and having that learner-centered approach help us, we hope, to stay sort of relevant. So let's pick up some example we've had in terms of trend or crisis unfolding. When the war in Ukraine broke last year, we quickly realized that there was something we could do to help this potentially new audience of learners coming through that got involved into the response because they are in the region. But Polish, Ukrainian, Russian are not languages we speak within my team, and are not like languages we can manage a whole interface and a whole sort of library. However, we still wanted to make sure that the content we own, that we managed to translate in these languages, we had to make sure learners who might not speak English still can find their way to that page in the platform. So we work with the system to make sure, there was a self-registration page when they create their account at first in their languages, and then when they land on the page, even if it's the welcome page is in English, there is a box so people can, and there is a screen capture there, so people can easily, or we hope, easily get there. What we've learned, what we know, and what was highlighted by the war in Ukraine is like a lot of the resources, if we think about mental health and that sort of support, it's not only the humanitarian responder that will need that, but the community that hosts refugees, the community that get affected. So we just thought we can't expect that audience to create a platform on an account on a platform, remember the password and navigate the platform. So what we've done is move away from our platform and host some of our content on a YouTube page we have for Disaster Ready, where all you do is click on the link and you can play the video. And we've created some of these resources in the video format, so they can get some support for mental health support very easily and easily share that within their community and the people around them. So even though our service is based on a learning platform, we also know that we had to adapt, and we could do that quite easily. And right now we are working on translating this video on mental health that we created with the container group in Hebrew because of the situation unfolding in Israel and in Gaza. So it's all this sort of agility that we have the chance to have skills and access to knowledge to be able to do that and slightly adjust our model so we can remain relevant. We also heard about how I think in some of the responses I saw, the sort of self-directed, it's all very nice, but there can be a digital learning fatigue, or you can be overwhelmed. It's like you get into a candy shop and it's so much choice, where do you go? So we're aware of that, and being this open platform. So what we try to do is with my team is sort of working with organizations that use Disaster Ready as part of one tool in their sort of hybrid learning toolbox, and help them have a communication sort of messages and a landing page to help position that wide library within their strategy. So we want to make sure people don't get, in addition to working on a good user experience, we want to make sure organizations that leverage the platform can help their learner navigate it, get familiar with it, and then consequently hopefully grow their curiosity and their growth mindset, so they then get comfortable navigating the switch up and don't get sort of lost in the offer. I also saw in the chat things around like learning at the point of need versus, and enhancing sort of performance content versus more in-depth learning. So again, we try to navigate that with the content we curate and the content we could develop. So it's, I know I'm up for time, right? So I might have to squeeze quickly that that's a few illustration of how we try to respond to the really broad need of our audience within the limitation of being a self-based, self-directed platform. But at the end of the day, as I said, we don't have to be everything for everyone, and we all work together. So it's about collaborating to address some of the issues we've heard during the polls. The next slide we won't go in detail, but it's just a few testimony of our learner, because at the end of the day, I can tell you we're doing a great work, but it's not for me to say it. It's really our user. We can share that and how we meet some of this trend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's interesting insight into the role of access and languages and flexibility and improving access, which leads us on very nicely to Nancy. Nancy Mureti, so from the head of regional centres for Humanitarian Leadership Academy. And I believe, Nancy, you're going to be looking at your particular field of interest is how learning formats and innovation can help drive access. So can you explain to us what that entails for you and your organisation?
Thank you, Anna, and I've put a timer so I can fit within the time because I tend to give many stories. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who is on this call. And I think before I go into my presentation, I'll speak a bit about how we are organizing the Humanitarian Leadership Academy. So we are a team of 85 staff from digital learning to marketing to research to BD. But within that team of 85, we have 26 staff that are based in regional centers. And I think as part of our locally led action, we recognize the need to have capacity strengthening closer to the crisis. So at the moment, we're organized in 6 regional centers where we have staff who are able to link directly with some of those responses that we're working on and are able to contextualize and are easily able to deploy because they are based within the crisis. So we have the 6 regional centers: East and Southern Africa, West and Central Africa, Eastern Europe, especially in response to the Ukraine crisis. We have Asia Pacific, and we have LAC based in El Salvador. So just to give you a scope of how we are organized and how that is part of locally led action. So if we can go to the next slide. So I think a lot of us are very aware of CHS, but now I just want to take it a bit to what we're doing in the humanitarian and response space. As I mentioned, we're in 6 regional centers, all with very different, unique contexts. And what we try to do is understand where is the need and what is the need. So what we do is at the different regions, we conduct very broad learning needs analysis that's looking predominantly at humanitarian topics as well as partnership topics, just to get a learning trend for the region. So we usually conduct that in the regional offices where SEI is established, and with moving to locally led action, the latest LNA that we conducted in West and Central Africa actually incorporated partner needs. So the LNA just looks at the different topical areas where the greatest need is, what's most relevant for their work, and how can we best design training so that it's appropriate to the context. And I can give an example again for West and Central Africa because it's quite recently done. One of the key needs that came up was having coaching and mentoring and having very short 1 to 2 day topical trainings in addition to online learning. So that also helps us be able to design our learning. Also, we are able to identify the demographic, and you realize in different contexts, there are different demographics. Again, using this one, when we looked at the response rate of the humanitarians that we're working with, over 62% or over 40 years old. So even just looking at things like that demographic, what does it mean for learning and how we design learning? We also do capacity gaps analysis for like very specific sector needs, like child protection in emergencies. We had a blended 9-month program, but mostly based on what were the gaps that were analyzed within that sector, and that's for very sector specific trainings. And then we use the competencies that have been based by sector leaders like the Alliance for Child Protection. So that's how we identify the need and also identify how we can deliver. Then we take it a step further. When we identify a cohort of people who want to be trained in the broader areas, then we dive down and do a training needs analysis for this specific cohort of learners. And within the training needs analysis, we get very specific. We also administer some Washington group disability questionnaire questions so that we're able to tailor make our training to adapt to some of the needs that are identified there. So I think in terms of identifying the need, that's what we do. I think we can go to the next slide. And how do we deliver? And I won't speak a lot about online learning, because I think the two speakers before me were able to tackle that. I'll just dive in a little into some of these ways we deliver. So one of them is face-to-face training, and we've recognized the importance of face-to-face training. I think you've been able to mention that. So we'd use the Kaya platform mostly for transferring knowledge, so the self-directed knowledge transfer, and the face-to-face just to have more practical learning. And this has been very useful in humanitarian contexts. I can give an example of Sudan. As we were doing delivering training based on the needs that were identified, we recognized that there was a huge element of well-being required. So we're able to facilitate a well-being session. So just being the face-to-face has helped us be very agile in our delivery. We've also done hybrid learning. We were to deliver an education in emergencies fundamentals course in Mozambique, and another cyclone hit, and there were travel advisories. This was already planned, resources had already been organized. So what we're able to do is our subject matter experts who are based in Nairobi worked closely with some of their graduates who are based in Mozambique. Then we had all the learners in one room, ensured that they had access to internet. So it was hybrid. So you have the facilitators in the within the context, but you also had facilitators who dialed in to provide any support that they needed. I can give one other example on this. We work very closely in partnerships in the humanitarian context. I know we mostly deliver as NGOs, but we recognize the importance for locally led action to include government officials and partners. We had an agreement with the Humanitarian Aid Commission for Sudan, where we were able to train their regional humanitarian leads in the government. Unfortunately, with the war, some of these commissions have been disbanded. But I think the more critical thing to recognize is now that they have the skills and they are within the context, and we have no access to that context, or very limited access. They are the ones who are able to deliver quality programming or cascade some of the learning that we did. So to the next page, we also work very closely, look at paying it forward, where we have our graduates be subsequent trainers and provide coaching and mentoring to our participants. And we also convene spaces, and we call them think shops, where we have partners, SCI staff, INGOs, donor agencies sit in one room, and we start brainstorming on what does locally led action look like, and then we learn lessons from our partners. We also have an alumni for each of the cohorts that we train, usually a WhatsApp group, especially for the long-term programs, and that's how we've been able to keep in touch. I can give an example. One of our graduates from CPIE right now is in West Bank and is looking to see how he can support with capacity strengthening, and we look at how we can share some resources with him on child protection. And the last page, I know I've spoken really fast. So the last slide is, we are very responsive when crisis hits, and we have response learning hubs, which is on the next page, where we curate content from different service providers, not just content that we've created, and have it in one space. So you have humanitarian essentials, you have operations, you have technical areas like CPIE, where we've curated the content and then also been able to translate it into different languages. And we've been able to respond to the Ukraine crisis and translated this whole response hub into Ukrainian or relevant content. We have an OPT Israel response hub at the moment. So we have this in Arabic, we have Spanish resources, we have Ukrainian, French, and other key languages. I've spoken really quickly, and I hope I've just landed it, but near the crisis, needs-based, and looking for locally led action.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. That's brilliant. Yeah, really interesting to have that focus on the sort of mixing different formats and particularly adapting them to the context where your regional centres are based and where obviously the crises are, which brings me on to Juliet. And Juliet from ALNAP, so you've recently conducted research into how leaders in the sector learn, as well as other things. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned from this?
Yeah, sure. So just to introduce ALNAP, for those who aren't familiar with us, we're the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in the Humanitarian Sector. So we're the learning network for the humanitarian sector. And our job really is to support the collective learning initiatives, so those that can't be addressed by individual agencies alone, and also to support the sector to get better at learning. One of the things that we've observed over our 26 years is a fundamental shift in the learning challenge for the sector. When ALNAP was first set up, one of the challenges was that there was insufficient evidence, insufficient numbers of evaluations and research, and there just wasn't enough capturing of knowledge and learning within the sector. That's really changed now. There are still some critical evidence gaps, of course, that need to be addressed, but the real learning challenge now is less about finding out what we need to know, but more about creating the spaces for busy humanitarians to actually absorb and engage with the evidence and learning that exists. And really we find three challenges. One is around inequitable access to learning within the humanitarian sector, with the majority of flexible financing still going to northern institutions. That's where the learning capacities sit. And actually within the nations and regions globally, there is less learning capacity, which is itself an inhibitor to learning within the sector. The second is around the ability of busy humanitarians to make sense of the wealth of learning that now exists. Nobody is managing to keep up with the reading that they want to be able to do to really make the best of the learning that's captured within the sector. And the third is that the reality is that even when people know what needs to be done, the realities of creating change within teams and organizations in the system on the basis of learning is really hard. So even in new crises where people know what the good practice is, actually being able to influence approaches to make those changes is really, really difficult. So there was a few challenges that a lot of it overlaps with what others have already said, which is great. But one thing is that, to note, I'm not talking so much about training, because the others really are the training specialists, but within learning, there's of course also research, M&E, communities of practice, knowledge hubs, opportunities to exchange, and in that broader learning environment. One of the things that we recognized within the humanitarian sector is that very little is known about actually the different audiences. So there's very little evidence about how best to segment or differentiate different humanitarian audiences in order to best be able to tailor learning approaches to work for them. And this is an area where I think learning and the training provision is hopefully, I think, ahead of some of the rest of us, but certainly in the areas of kind of research and M&E, we aren't nearly as good at understanding how to communicate the important learning to those people that can make best use of it. So, and of course, humanitarian audiences are massively diverse, and have different preferences and different pressures on their time. Just to pick up on a few examples of things that we found through the audience research that we did last year. One is people are very keen on use of, for example, LinkedIn and other knowledge hubs. So there's a big kind of desire for humanitarians to be better connected with each other, to exchange with each other. But on the whole, humanitarians prefer to sit quietly and watch what other people are posting, rather than being willing to contribute themselves, which means that, to make knowledge hubs and learning exchange work, actually, they don't just happen on their own. They need a lot of facilitation and a lot to actually bring humanitarians into the conversation to be ready to contribute. The second one is some of the work that we did with senior leaders within the humanitarian sector, who are making the highest volume of strategic decisions, but have the least time to engage with the learning and evidence that exists. And so we've developed a kind of briefings approach. And what we found was that actually everybody is anxious. They don't know as much as they should know in order to be able to do their jobs. And again, that brings in that challenge about how do we best give them the information that they need in order to be able to do their jobs in a very time-intensive environment. And we found really this sort of emperor's new clothes, where actually what people wanted was a really straightforward briefing that just gave them, the background on the evidence and discourse that exists within the sector in a way that they could take it on. The other was that people were asking, and this probably overlaps with stuff the others are doing, to demystify complex concepts. So this was a barrier to people engaging in learning conversations, because, for example, nobody understands climate change, climate financing. It's really, really complicated. And actually, for the sector to be able to engage in those sorts of issues, we need to be able to bring people on board to really understand those fundamental concepts so that we can learn and exchange on it. The other is around whose knowledge, which Esther mentioned in the beginning. And this is really important, because on the whole, that we still find that learning approaches and research approaches still are very dominated by northern assumptions around how best to make those approaches. And there's still insufficient space created or enabled within the sector for that really important project level and program level learning and exchange in ways that suit more diverse and different approaches to learning. So, and that has implications for training curricula, for online or face-to-face, for our assumptions around how to provide learning in different formats. But we know that there are some really interesting approaches being tried, but we are a long way from making a shift to really creating the space for recognition of and respect for more diverse learning approaches that would be more appropriate at in different cultural contexts.
Great, thank you very much, Juliet. It's a great wrap up with a more sort of a macro level view, and not focusing so much on training, but looking at the broader picture of learning, and then obviously how training fits into that, but not just training. Thank you very much, all panelists. That's been a really edifying, really interesting presentations. What I'd like to do now is we've got some questions coming through in the Q&A, and there's still an opportunity for anyone who wants to raise a question for the panel. You can still write your questions in there, but maybe I can start with one of the questions that has come forward, and I address this to all of you, and you can answer as you whoever feels most appropriate. How do you manage, so it's a question from Claude, who's saying, how do you manage variances in learning capabilities among beneficiaries? And I believe by beneficiaries, I believe we learners we were talking about here, which might not be evident in online learning, but become apparent in a hybrid format with in-person sessions. So who would like to respond to that question?
I can get started, and I think, we have to be realistic in terms of the online, like from a point of view of disaster ready, for instance. We know it can be an issue in terms of access. So we've heard about connectivity, the fluency of using that. So we know it might not always be the best solution, but that's why we've tried to create content that is short, and some format have a PDF that can be downloaded, so people can then take that and have time to go through it even if they're not connected. We worked with around the standard for accessibility around people who have difficulty with sight, or making sure that the content is adapted when we create content to that certain disability. We and that what we do, we have like organization that will use some of the content for their staff, or train themselves with certain content, and then they take that knowledge and they will meet with like community group or local partner and use that as their foundational content to then deliver training. So it's yes, it's online, and the first model is you go and you take it, but it's also taking that as a trainer or as a capacity building sort of group, and then you just adjust, you take that training and you adjust it to the need where you are at the moment of need. So don't know if it's fully answering the question, but maybe my colleagues can add to it. And thank you for the question in the first place.
Thanks. Perhaps I can add. Thank you. Thank you. So I think the question is the concern, I think, is if there is variabilities in the learners, you can address that a lot more a lot easier if you are directing a learning session yourself. So I think I agree with you that it's a bit of a challenge if you can't have access face-to-face. So the way that we've approached it, a couple of ways, is to ensure that the content of the online learning is really interactive. So it's not sort of a dry, one-dimensional learning experience. We put in things like, there's a pre-assessment and a post-assessment, which I think people like to see, how knowledge is gained through the process of learning. There's some interactivity that goes with that, videos and so on, so that, depending on the learner type, maybe the videos are much preferable for those who want to read. There's links to reading, there's sort of reflective pieces of work. So we've tried to put all of that in the learning experience. When we've not been able to deliver face-to-face, which has been relatively often, what we've offered is a blended learning. So the parts of the learning that are amenable to independent learning have been developed independently and are done asynchronously, and people can download and do that offline. For the parts that would require some engagement and interaction, we've done through live workshops and used the facilities that Zoom particularly offers, and Teams, like breakout rooms and whiteboards and so on. So we've done a mix of both and sort of tried to mitigate the not being in person to address that. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you very much, both of you. No, that's great. I'm just skimming through some of the other questions. There are a couple of questions relative to the learning, specifically to learning platforms, which I'll maybe ask Em and Nancy to respond to. There's one from Dennis about how learning platforms are being made accessible for persons with disabilities, for example. There's another question that which is linked to sort of access. And this, again, I'll put it to everyone, for the whole panel, and it's sort of what strategies or technologies or formats do you believe can help overcome the risks associated with specifically the digital divide in online learning? I don't know who would like to answer that.
Well, let me just, I mean, when I go through the inbox we have from our learner, almost every day we have learner asking for a PDF or document to download, and that's really connectivity issue, and that's where you can have all the technology of the world, but if we don't meet people where they are, then we're missing the point. So again, there is only so much we can do from this niche where we are, but this is where some of the content we develop have a downloadable PDF, a PDF version, so that can't work for everything, and that's why, as I said before, we try to work around standard to make sure it's accessible to certain people with certain learning disability or something similar, and it's where we know that we can't be, we have to be part of a more hybrid approach of work with partnerships. So we feel some of the need with that online content that people can take and then address in the place where they are to meet some challenge that we can't address. But maybe my colleague from the HLA can add to what they're doing, or Dr. Mamsallah.
Yeah, I think you've covered it, especially on the online elements, being able to have low resolution, downloadable formats that need very limited internet. But also, I think, as I'd mentioned before, is having trained people within those crisis-affected areas so that they can do bite-sized training for responders. For areas, again, where there could be limited connectivity, we can collaborate with our SC office there to be able to save some of the content on flash disks, or in some instances, we support in some of our programs with giving them access to internet, just like buying bundles or having everybody in a room and using one resource to be able to train them. So apart from all the online elements that have been mentioned, we also work really closely with people on the ground. Right now, there's the Afghanistan earthquake crisis that we are looking to respond to in the long term, and we're mapping out what graduates are there and who can go and just augment some of the learning that you'll get from the response learning hubs.
Great, thank you. Juliet or Mamsallah, do you have anything to add to that question, or shall we move on to the next one?
Thanks. I just wanted to say, apart from just maybe the digitized divide itself in terms of actual access to the technology, I think there's something to be said about digital literacy and how to use the learning itself effectively as a learner. And I do think that there is, we sort of produce the learning, but I think there's a first step that we probably don't pay enough attention to, and that's ensuring that people can maximize the learning, and that's through sort of learning around digital literacy itself. And I don't have the answers, but I think there's something to be said about that.
Great, thank you.
Can I jump in and grab a question, Anna?
Yes.
There's one that I'm super keen to hear people's answers to, because I know that we have 5 minutes too, which is the question from Xavier here in the chat. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And he's asking about, he's saying a lot of training focuses on delivering content and a little bit on analysing individual learner learning, but there's a lack of follow-up to see if this translates into real learning at institutional level and changes in aid delivery. So I'd be really interested to hear people's views on that, particularly the kind of institutional learning piece, because I think that sort of feeds a bit back into what we were talking about earlier on the kind of localization thing as well. How are we strengthening organizations as well as individuals through our work?
Yeah, I can say a couple of things on that because I thought that was a really interesting question. The answer is it's really, really hard. If organizations and approaches aren't changing, then nothing's been learned. And the realities of organizational change are really complex. We would say that what we need is more and more diverse learning points within the sector that are embedded within where decisions and action happen. And that should be through training, but also through all these range of other kind of learning approaches as well. And we need more of them and more diverse and more embedded. But we also need to address issues around organizational change as well. We know that organizations are comparatively good in many areas at what we call single loop learning, so getting better at what they already do. And that's where good knowledge transfer and learning fits very well. What organizations are less good at is things outside that. So actually stepping back and questioning whether they were the right interventions in the first place, or actually if we're the right ones to be doing the work, or some of those bigger questions. And we know that the incentive structures within the system don't actually create space or enable that. Our competitive environment, our need to deliver at scale and speed all play against that much more reflective learning space. And it's very difficult for organizations to create it. And one of the things that we found is that actually the creation of organizational cultures for learning in organizations is way behind where we want it to be or where it needs to be for us to actually be able to take on board and scale the learning that we're investing in at an individual level. And that's a really big organizational challenge, I think. And the other thing is to recognize that learning is not linear. So there is no straightforward pathway of investing individuals who influence teams and approaches who influence organizations. It just doesn't happen like that. And it's a much more complex web of opportunity and chance that creates change. And so I think that we have to also be quite moderate in our expectations about how much can change. We know the system is good at incremental change and that we need to keep working in that way, but also recognizing the system and diversifying and increasing the number of learning points across it, the kind of learning exoskeleton for the sector.
So well put. Thank you, Juliet. Nancy, did you want to jump in on that? This will be our last one.
Yeah, just really quickly. And I think that was very comprehensive, Julia, especially at individual learner follow-up on learning. But what we do in the HLA, we have a pillar called civil society organizational strengthening. So we've been able to train partners on using an organizational capacity assessment tool. And once they are able to go through that tool with their teams, they identify areas that they have gaps, and then we curate learning and we do team learning or team training. And you'll find not just OD areas come up, but technical areas like how do you coach and mentor, how do you ensure well-being of your staff. So we just don't target the individual level, but we also look at what's the organizational need.
Thank you, Nancy. Okay, I think we could go on for much longer because there's lots of interesting questions in the chat, and I think that would have been a really interesting conversation to carry on with about how, you know, the importance of learning culture and learning relationships against, you know, the increasing use of technology. I think that's a kind of interesting contrast there. But we have to close, so let me just I have to trail this, which is our next webinar. So this is for people that are kind of really involved in like the learning design side of things. There's a webinar coming on blended learning if anybody's interested in joining that. And you can find the joining details on our website. And aside from that, here are some contact details, so you can get in touch with people afterwards if you'd like to. We're also going to circulate a handout with some of the kind of key points that came out of today, and that will also have the kind of contact details and links that people have referred to as well in it. And we'll also circulate the recording and the slides. But thanks everybody for all of your engagement and all of your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to your question, but hopefully we'll be able to organise a similar webinar and a kind of follow-up discussion on a kind of related topic. And thank you so much to all of our speakers and to my co-host Anna. Great, thanks very much everybody.
Thanks Anna and Esther, and thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, bye.